She had poured tea for earls. She had poured it for viscounts, for foreign diplomats, for men whose names appeared in the pages of Debrett's peerage beside titles that stretched back 3 centuries. She had stood at their elbows with a silver pot and a steady hand, and not one of them had ever looked at her face. That was the arrangement. That was what 5 years at Ashworth Manor had taught her, how to become invisible in a room full of people, how to move through silk and wool and the thick fog of cigar smoke without leaving a single impression behind. Emma Ashby had become very good at disappearing. But on the morning of the 14th of October, in the year 1814, a man walked through the doors of Ashworth Manor's great dining room and stopped. He did not reach for his teacup. He did not unfold his napkin or greet the gentleman already seated. He simply stood at the threshold and looked at the young woman pouring tea at the far end of the table as if he had seen something the rest of the room had entirely failed to notice. And what happened next would unravel 5 years of careful silence in the span of a single sentence. Emma had not always known how to be invisible. There had been a time, she was perhaps 11, perhaps 12, when she had walked into rooms with her chin lifted, when she had answered questions before they were fully asked, when her father had called her asterisk sharp as a blade and twice as difficult. He had said it with a laugh in those days. The laugh had disappeared well before he did. Charles Ashby had died in the spring of 1809, leaving behind 3 things of note: a modest house in Wiltshire, a collection of debts that would have embarrassed a man with less charm and more sense, and a daughter he had not quite gotten around to making arrangements for. The house went to the creditors almost immediately. The debts, it turned out, were considerably more modest than first feared, because a significant portion of them had already been quietly settled. By whom, Emma had not known at the time. She had been told only that a gentleman had intervened, that the matter was resolved, and that she was to pack what she could carry and travel to Ashworth Manor in Derbyshire, where she would be received as a ward of the Duke. She had expected gratitude to feel simpler than it did. Aldrich Voss, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, had met her in the entrance hall on the afternoon of her arrival. He was not what she had imagined, not that she had imagined very much, grief still sitting heavy in her chest, and her trunk still smelling of the Wiltshire house she would never return to. He was tall, and younger than she had expected, and he had looked at her for a long moment before saying, with the precise economy of a man who rarely wastes words, "You'll be given a room in the East Wing. Mrs. Holt will show you." And that had been that. No explanation of the arrangement, no mention of her father, or the debts, or what exactly it meant to be a ward of a duke who did not appear to particularly want a ward. Emma had followed Mrs. Holt up 2 flights of stairs to a room that was neither servants' quarters nor guest chamber, somewhere in between, like Emma herself, and she had sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without unpacking anything. In the weeks that followed, she learned the rhythms of Ashworth Manor the way one learns the rhythms of a place that does not especially want to be understood. The Duke rose early and retired late. He did not take meals with the household unless guests were present. He managed his estates with a thoroughness that impressed his tenants and exhausted his secretary. And he had a habit of standing at the window of his study in the late afternoon, with an expression that Emma could never quite read from the corridor. Not unhappiness precisely, but something adjacent to it. She was not a servant. She was told this more than once by Mrs. Holt and by the housekeeper, and once by the Duke himself in passing, when she had made a motion to help clear a table, and he had stopped her with a single look. That is not your function here. But she was not a guest, either. She was not introduced to visitors. She was not included in the evenings when the drawing room filled with neighbors and acquaintances. She occupied the peculiar middle ground of the almost belonging, present enough to be noticed, undefined enough to be ignored. The only person at Ashworth Manor who treated her with any consistency was the Duke's mother. Lady Constance Voss was 71 years old, suffered from a knee that predicted rain more reliably than any barometer, and had opinions about almost everything, delivered in a tone that suggested she had arrived at them after considerable deliberation and expected no serious opposition. She had taken one look at Emma on her third morning at the Manor and said, without preamble, "Come and sit with me. You look like someone who needs a cup of tea and a great deal less thinking." Emma had sat with her every morning since. Lady Constance called her little one asterisk sometimes, or my dear, but there were moments, rare, unguarded moments, when the older woman called her something else entirely. "Come here, Klein Herrschaft," she had said once, the German slipping out before she caught it. Little lady. Emma had not thought much of it at the time. She had learned to pour tea in the second year, not because anyone asked her, but because the mornings were long and the house was large, and there was only so much one could read before the words began to blur at the edges. She had begun helping in small ways. A tray carried, a letter sorted, a vase arranged. The staff had accepted her assistance with the cautious courtesy one offers a person whose exact status remains unclear, and the Duke had not told her to stop. By the fifth year, she knew the household better than most people in it. She knew which guests preferred their tea strong and which preferred it weak, which of the visiting lords had a tendency to help themselves to the silver inkwells if left unattended, and which of the kitchen maids was conducting a correspondence that the head housekeeper would have considered highly inadvisable. She knew the layout of the estate in winter and summer. She knew that the Duke walked the south garden at 11 o'clock in the evening when something was troubling him, and that the something was not infrequent. She did not know why she was there. That was the one thing, the central, unanswered thing, that she had never managed to find the edges of. The debts had been paid. The house had been sold. There was no reason, practical or otherwise, for the Duke of Ashworth to have taken responsibility for a girl he did not know, to have housed and fed her for 5 years, to have allowed her to become part of the furniture of his home without ever once explaining why. She had asked in the early days, twice. Both times the Duke had looked at her with that expression she could not read, not unkind, exactly, but closed, the way a window is closed against weather, and said only that her father had been a man worth respecting, and that the arrangement was satisfactory. It was not an answer, but Emma had eventually stopped asking for one. On the morning of the 14th of October, she was informed at breakfast that she would be needed to assist with the tea service. The head housemaid, whose name was Bridget and whose reliability under ordinary circumstances was beyond reproach, had developed a fever in the night. The other maids were occupied with the preparation of the dining room and the airing of the guest chambers. Mrs. Holt delivered the news with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had managed crises of considerably greater proportions than a housemaid's fever, and she looked at Emma in a way that was not quite asking, but was not quite telling, either. Emma had said yes. She had stood at the door of the morning room afterward for a moment, silver pot in hand, and she had looked down at herself, at the plain gray dress, the hair pulled back with the practical severity she had adopted years ago, and she had felt something that was not quite humiliation, because humiliation requires an element of surprise, and she had long since stopped being surprised by the shape of her own life. What she felt was closer to anger, quiet, disciplined, very old anger, worn smooth by the years like a stone in a riverbed. She carried it into the dining room with her, the same way she carried the teapot, steadily, with both hands without spilling a drop. The room, when she entered it, was already filling. The Duke was at the head of the table. 3 lords she recognized. 2 she did not. A foreign gentleman whose name she had heard mentioned in connection with some matter of state, speaking in low, careful English to the man beside him. And at the far end of the room, just inside the door, arriving late, shedding his overcoat, a man she had never seen before. Emma did not look at him twice. She began at the far end of the table and worked her way down. She was nearly finished when she heard the chair scrape. The sound of a chair being pushed back is not, ordinarily, a remarkable thing. In a room full of men conducting the business of empire over breakfast, chairs move constantly, adjusted, angled, abandoned. Emma had learned not to notice such sounds the same way she had learned not to notice a great many things at Ashworth Manor. You develop a kind of selective attention after 5 years. You hear what you are meant to hear and let the rest pass through you like water through a sieve. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, unhurried. The sound of a man who had made a decision and was now carrying it out without any particular concern for whether the room found the decision convenient. Emma was mid-pour when she heard it. The tea left the spout in a clean, dark arc. She did not look up. She set the pot back on the tray with the careful, practiced motion she had perfected over 1,000 mornings, and she was reaching for the next cup when she heard the footsteps. Measured, crossing the room. Coming toward her. She looked up then. She could not help it. The man was perhaps 50, silver-haired and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that suggested a long acquaintance with outdoor weather and a shorter one with indoor diplomacy. He was dressed well but not extravagantly. He moved through the room with the ease of a person who has never once considered whether he belongs somewhere, who simply belongs everywhere, as a matter of long-established fact. He stopped beside her. The room had not gone quiet yet. That happened a moment later, a slow, rippling silence that moved down the length of the table like a wave, as the men nearest to them stopped talking and the men farther away followed suit, responding to some instinctive social current, the way a room always knows before it knows why, that something has shifted. The man looked at Emma. Not the way people looked at her in this house, through her, past her, in the general direction of the tea. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been searching for and have just found in an unexpected place. Emma stood very still. He extended his hand. "My lady," he said. 2 words. That was all, delivered in a voice that carried, without effort or apparent intention, to every corner of the room. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Emma was aware, in the distant, clinical way one becomes aware of things during moments of shock, of several things simultaneously. The weight of the teapot in her hand, the absolute stillness of the man at the head of the table, the face of Lord Harcastle, 3 seats down, frozen mid-chew with an expression of pure social bewilderment. The foreign gentleman, who did not know enough of the room's history to understand what he was witnessing, but understood enough of human nature to know that whatever it was, it mattered. She was aware also of her own heartbeat, which had done something complicated and was now returning slowly to its usual pace. She set down the teapot. Her hand was steady. She was grateful for that later when she replayed the moment. Whatever happened inside her in those 3 seconds, her hand was steady. She looked at the man, this stranger who had crossed a room to extend a courtesy she had not been offered in 5 years, and she said, with a composure she did not entirely feel, "I am afraid you may have mistaken me for someone else, sir." "I do not believe I have," he said, quietly, for her alone. He lowered his hand. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look anything except very certain, the way a man looks when he holds a card he has been waiting a long time to play. Then he turned and walked back to his seat. The silence in the room lasted another moment. Then conversation resumed carefully, in lower voices than before, with the particular quality of words being chosen rather than simply spoken. Emma was aware of eyes on her back as she lifted the tray. She did not turn around. What she did not see, what she learned only much later, from a source she had not expected, was the expression on the Duke's face in the seconds after the man returned to his chair. She did not see it because she had made a decision, sometime in the 2nd year at Ashworth Manor, never to look at the Duke in moments that might cost her something. It was a small, private act of self-preservation. You protect what little you have. But the Duke had looked at her. He had looked at her the moment the words left the man's mouth, and he had not looked away for a very long time. What was in his face in that moment, whether it was guilt or relief or something more complicated than either of those, was a question Emma would not think to ask until it was almost too late to matter. She carried the tray out of the room without spilling a single drop. In the corridor, she stopped. She stood with her back against the wall, the tray balanced in her hands, the silence of the empty passage around her. From the dining room she could hear the low, resumed murmur of voices, the clink of silver on china, the ordinary sounds of powerful men returning to their business. She breathed in once, breathed out. "My lady." She had not been called that since the morning of her father's funeral, when the vicar had mispronounced her name and apologized afterward in a way that made it worse. She did not know the man who had said it. She did not know how he knew her, or what he meant by it, or what business he imagined he was conducting by crossing a room full of dukes and lords to extend his hand to a woman holding a teapot. She did not know why his eyes had held that particular quality, recognition, and something underneath recognition, something that looked, if she were being honest with herself, a great deal like long-held sorrow. She knew one thing. He had not mistaken her for someone else. She pushed off the wall. She walked back toward the kitchens with the empty tray. She kept her face entirely still, the way she had learned to keep it, smooth as water, giving nothing away. But something had changed in the room when that man rose from his chair, and Emma could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds have gathered, in the air, in the pressure, in the particular quality of the silence that follows a thing that cannot be unsaid. She did not know yet what it meant. She suspected, with a certainty that had no logical basis and every emotional one, that she was about to find out. She did not see the man again until after the guests had gone. Lunch had concluded. The foreign gentleman had departed in a hired carriage shortly before 2. Lords Harcastle and Fenwick had taken their horses, and their carefully maintained expressions of having witnessed nothing down the drive by 1:30. The remaining guests, a solicitor whose name Emma had never been told, and a young lord who appeared to be present primarily for decorative purposes, had retreated to the library with port and the particular air of men who intend to stay until someone asks them to leave. Emma had spent the intervening hours in the East Wing, doing nothing particularly useful. She had attempted to read. She had read the same paragraph 4 times and retained none of it. She had stood at the window for a while and looked at the drive without seeing it. She had thought, with some deliberateness, about the laundry inventory she had promised Mrs. Holt she would review, and she had not reviewed it. She had thought about 2 words instead. "My lady." The thing about those words, the thing she kept returning to, turning over in her mind like a stone she expected to find something written underneath, was not the words themselves. It was the certainty with which they had been delivered. There had been no hesitation in the man's voice. No question. He had not said it the way one says something polite and approximate, the way people in drawing rooms say charming or delightful to mean nothing at all. He had said it as a statement of fact, the way you say the sky is gray or the river is high, as something that simply is, regardless of whether the room finds it convenient. She was still at the window when she heard the knock. It was Mrs. Holt. Would Miss Ashby come downstairs? There was a gentleman who wished to speak with her. Emma looked at her own reflection in the glass for a moment, the plain gray dress, the hair, the face that had learned over 5 years to give very little away, and then she straightened her shoulders and went. He was waiting in the small parlor off the entrance hall. The room was rarely used. It smelled faintly of beeswax and disuse, and the particular cold of rooms that do not get enough sun. He was standing at the window when she entered, and he turned when he heard her footsteps. In the full light of the afternoon, without the charged atmosphere of the dining room, he looked older than she had first thought. The lines around his eyes were deep. There was something in his expression that she might have called, in another man, in another circumstance, grief. The kind that has been carried so long it has become simply part of the face, like a scar grown over. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You look like your mother," he said finally. "Around the eyes. I noticed it the moment I came in." Emma had been prepared for a number of openings. She had not been prepared for that one. "I did not know my mother," she said. "She died when I was 3. "I know," he paused. "I was at her funeral. I have thought of her and of you a great many times since." He clasped his hands behind his back. "My name is Everett Cavendish, Lord Everett Cavendish. Your mother, Miss Ashby, or rather," he stopped, began again. "Your mother was born Helena Vane. She was the daughter of my father's first cousin. The Vane line is a cadet branch of the Cavendish family, considerably older than most people now living would know." Emma said nothing. She was listening the way she had learned to listen at Ashworth Manor, with her whole attention and very little expression. "Your mother's branch was estranged, is perhaps the word. There was a disagreement. Several decades ago, before you were born, before your mother was born. The sort of disagreement that families of a certain kind are very good at maintaining across generations because pride is, in my experience, the most durable substance known to man." Something moved across his face. "I was young when your mother married. I knew who she was, but I was not," he exhaled. "I did not do what I should have done when she died. And I did not do what I should have done when your father died. And I have spent a great deal of time since wondering how much of your life has been shaped by my failures of action." He looked at her directly then. "Your full name," he said, "is Emma Helena Vane Ashby. The Vane name carries with it, under the terms of your great-grandmother's settlement, a courtesy title. You are, by right, Lady Emma. You have been Lady Emma since the morning of your birth. No one removed that from you. It was simply," he paused, "not spoken." The room was very quiet. Emma stood with her hands folded in front of her and looked at Lord Cavendish, and felt something moving through her that she could not immediately identify. It was not joy, exactly. It was not the simple relief she might have expected if someone had described this moment to her in the abstract. It was something larger and more complicated than either of those. A feeling like a room you have lived in your whole life, suddenly showing you a door you did not know was there. "Lord Cavendish," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any particular right to expect. "May I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything." "Did the Duke know?" The question arrived in the air between them and sat there. Lord Cavendish looked at her for a long moment. There was something careful in his expression now, careful in the way of a man who has decided to tell the truth and is deciding precisely how much of it. "That," he said, "is a question I think you should put to the Duke himself." It was not an answer. It was also, Emma understood in its way, an answer. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. She thanked Lord Cavendish, and she meant it, for the 2 words in the dining room, for the afternoon visit, for the long-delayed accounting that no one had ever thought to render. She meant all of it. And then she walked out of the small, cold parlor and down the corridor, and she did not stop walking until she reached the east wing stairs, where she sat down on the bottom step, in the dim afternoon light, and pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked at nothing for a very long time. When she stood up again, her face was composed, but her jaw was set in a way it had never quite been set before. She went to find the Duke. She found him in the study at the end of the north corridor, the room she had walked past 1,000 times, the room with the window he stood at in the evenings, the room whose door was almost always closed. She knocked. A pause, then come. He was at his desk, papers, the end of a working day. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something cross his face, a swift, controlled movement, there and gone before she could read it properly. "Miss Ashby." "Did you know," Emma said, without preamble, without the careful management she usually applied to sentences in this room, "who I was when I arrived here?" It was not quite a question. She had not intended it to be. The Duke looked at her for a moment. He set down his pen. He did not look away from her face, and she did not look away from his, and the silence between them was different from the silences they had maintained for 5 years. Those had been empty silences, the silences of two people politely ignoring each other across a great distance. This one was full. This one had weight to it. "Yes," he said. One word. He did not dress it up. He did not precede it with qualification or follow it with immediate explanation. He simply said it, the way he said most things, directly, without ornament, as if the truth required no architecture around it. Emma breathed in through her nose. "You have known since the day I arrived." "Yes." "5 years." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back at her. She was aware of her own anger. She could feel it, precise and clean, like a blade she had not known she was carrying until this moment. And she was aware also, underneath the anger, of something worse. Something that felt, with a precision she found profoundly unwelcome, like the particular pain of a wound that has been there long enough to become familiar, and is now, finally, being named. "I think," she said with enormous care, "that you owe me an explanation." The Duke held her gaze. "I think you are right," he said. And for the first time in 5 years, he asked her to sit down. She had expected excuses. That was, she realized later, what she had been bracing for as she sat down across from him in the study. The leather chair that smelled of old books and wood smoke, the desk between them with its careful stacks of correspondence, the last of the afternoon light coming through the window at a low angle and laying itself across the floor in long, pale strips. She had been prepared for the architecture of justification. The careful sentence construction of a man explaining why what he did was, in fact, reasonable if you looked at it from the correct angle. She had not been prepared for what he actually said. He did not begin immediately. He rose from his desk and moved to the window, the one she had watched him stand at from the corridor on 100 evenings, the one she had always assumed framed some private difficulty she was not party to. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the darkening garden, and then he turned. "Your father," he said, "came to me 8 months before he died." Emma said nothing. She kept her hands flat on the arms of the chair. "He did not come about money. I want to be clear on that point first. The debts were, yes, there were debts, and yes, I settled them, but that was not why he came." He paused. "He came because he was frightened." The word landed quietly. "Frightened," Emma said. "There was a man, a particular man, who had taken an interest in your mother's family, in what remained of it. Your mother was the last of the vain line in the direct sense. When she died, that line passed through you. You became, at 3 years old, the sole holder of a name that carried," he stopped, chose his words. "There are old arrangements in old families, Miss Ashby. Entailments, settlements, property interests that have been buried under decades of estrangement and silence, and the general human preference for not examining uncomfortable things. Your great-grandmother's settlement, the one that carries the courtesy title Lord Cavendish described, it also carries something else. A claim, under certain legal circumstances, to a portion of the Cavendish estate. A significant portion." Emma was very still. "Most people did not know this," the Duke continued. "Your father did not know it for most of his life. He discovered it approximately 2 years before he died through correspondence he found among your mother's effects, correspondence he should perhaps have found sooner but did not, for reasons I imagine were largely painful." He looked at her. "When he discovered it, he did what a man does when he finds something valuable and frightening in equal measure. He told no one. And then, some time later, someone found out anyway." "Who?" "A man named Gideon Pell, a solicitor of the kind that makes the honest members of that profession quietly despair. He had made it his business for some years to identify dormant legal claims and encourage their resolution, in his preferred direction." The Duke's voice was even. "He approached your father. He proposed an arrangement. In exchange for your father's cooperation in suppressing the claim permanently, signing certain documents, relinquishing certain rights on your behalf, he would ensure the debts were managed quietly and your father would be left alone. And my father refused. Your father came to me instead. A long pause. Why you, Emma said. Something moved across the Duke's face. It was there and gone quickly. Not quite the controlled blankness she was accustomed to reading from him. Something more unguarded than that. Something she did not have a word for yet. Your father and I were at school together, he said. For 2 years when I was 14 and he was 16. We were not, it was a long time ago. But there are people you do not forget, regardless of how much distance accumulates between you. He was one of those people for me. He paused again. He trusted me. That is the simple answer. He trusted me, and he asked me to protect you if anything happened to him, and 4 months later something did. Emma realized she was gripping the arms of the chair. She loosened her hands deliberately. And protecting me, she said, meant bringing me here and telling me nothing. Protecting you meant making you invisible, the Duke said. That is not the same thing as nothing. He moved away from the window. He did not return to his desk. He stood somewhere between the two in the middle of the room, and for the first time since she had known him he looked not uncertain exactly, but something adjacent to it. A man on unfamiliar ground, walking carefully. Pell did not know what you looked like. He did not know your habits or your whereabouts, or whether you were the kind of woman who would one day discover what she was owed and do something about it. As long as you remained Miss Ashby, ward, household fixture, nobody of consequence, you were safe. The moment your name became known, the moment the vein connection surfaced, he would have come for me. He would have come for the claim. You would have been incidental to that, which is, in my experience, the most dangerous way to be in the path of a man like Pell. Emma looked at him. She thought about 5 years. She thought about gray dresses and tea trays and the East Wing room that was neither guest chamber nor servants' quarters. She thought about every moment she had spent in this house feeling like something uncategorizable, something the household had not quite found the right shelf for. She thought about the word *ward, the way it had always felt slightly wrong, like a coat that is almost the right size but not quite. You should have told me, she said. Her voice was quiet. It was not an accusation exactly. It was something more final than an accusation. Yes, he said simply, without argument. I spent 5 years not knowing why I was here. I know. I spent 5 years, she stopped. She was aware of the anger again, and aware also of something underneath it that she was not prepared to examine in this room in this light, with him looking at her the way he was looking at her, directly, steadily, without the closed window expression she had grown accustomed to. His face was open in a way she had not seen before. It was, she thought, considerably more difficult to be angry at him when his face was doing that. I asked you twice, she said. In the first year. I asked you directly, and you told me my father was a man worth respecting and the arrangement was satisfactory. I know what I told you. That was not an answer. No, he said, it was not. It was the answer of a man who had decided something on my behalf without consulting me. Yes, he held her gaze, it was. She breathed out. The light in the room had shifted while they had been speaking, the last of the afternoon giving way to the grayer, softer light of early evening, and in that light the study looked different than it ever had from the corridor, smaller, somehow, and more inhabited. There were books with broken spines on the shelves. A coat hung over the back of the second chair. A cup, long cold, on the corner of the desk. Small evidences of a person living in a room rather than performing in one. Pell, she said, is the threat still? Pell died in the spring of 1812. Something in the Duke's voice when he said it, careful and flat, the voice of a man describing something he has strong feelings about and has decided not to express. The threat, as it existed, died with him. Emma looked at him sharply. Then why, she said slowly, Did you not tell me, after that? If he was gone, if the reason for the secrecy was gone, why did you continue to? She stopped. Something was shifting in her understanding, the way shapes shift when you turn them in the light and find a new angle. You could have told me 2 years ago. You could have told me 2 years ago and given me back my name and explained everything and... She stopped again. She looked at the Duke. He was looking back at her, and his face was doing the thing she did not have a word for. The thing that was not quite the controlled blankness, and not quite anything she recognized from 5 years of watching him from corridors and doorways, and across the distances he had always carefully maintained. "Why didn't you?" she said, quietly. The anger had gone somewhere else. Something else was in its place, a question, large and carefully avoided, that had apparently been sitting in this room for quite some time. After Pell was gone, why didn't you tell me? The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said, "is a more complicated question than the first one." "I have time," Emma said. And she waited. He did not answer her that evening. He came close to it, she could see that, in the way a person can see the shape of something moving underwater without being able to make out what it is. He stood in the middle of his study with the evening light going gray around him, and he looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that she did not have a name for, and he opened his mouth, and then he closed it again. What he said instead was, "Lord Cavendish intends to remain in the area for several days. He will wish to speak with you further." It was a retreat, a clean one, executed with the precision of a man who has had long practice at it. Emma recognized it for what it was and chose, in that moment, not to press. Not because she was satisfied with it, she was not, but because there are moments when pushing a door harder does not open it faster, and she had spent 5 years learning to read the difference. She stood. She thanked him with a composure that cost her something, and she left. That night she lay awake for a long time in the East Wing room, and looked at the ceiling and thought about complicated answers. Lord Cavendish came the following morning. He arrived at 10 o'clock, which Emma had already learned was his preferred hour, punctual but not aggressive about it, the schedule of a man who respects other people's mornings. Mrs. Holt showed him to the small parlor, the one with the beeswax smell and the insufficient sun, and Emma came downstairs to find him already seated with a cup of tea he had apparently requested for himself, which she found, inexplicably, reassuring. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. He told her things she had not known, about her mother, Helena, who had been bright and stubborn and had laughed at things that were not strictly funny, and had died at 26 of a fever that moved too fast for anyone to stop. About the Vane family before the estrangement, before pride had calcified into silence and silence into a forgetting so complete that a woman could spend 5 years in a house without knowing her own name. About the settlement, the legal particulars of it, the document trail that Cavendish had spent the better part of 2 years quietly reassembling from solicitors' records and county archives, and one extraordinary box of correspondence he had found in his own attic that he had not known was there. He told her what she was owed, not in the language of sentiment, he was not that kind of man, but in the plain language of fact. The courtesy title, the legal recognition, and a small but real property interest in the Cavendish estate that he had no intention of contesting, and every intention of ensuring she received. And then he made her an offer. "Come to London," he said. "I have a house in Grosvenor Square. My wife, you will like her. She has your mother's quality of saying exactly what she means without apparent concern for the consequences. She has already said she would be glad of your company. We will have the matter of your name formalized within the month. You will be introduced properly. You will have," he paused, chose the word carefully, "a beginning. The beginning you should have had a long time ago." Emma looked at her hands in her lap. Outside the window, the Ashworth Gardens were doing their late October thing, the trees stripped back, the light thin and honest, everything reduced to its essential structure. She had watched those gardens change through 4 full cycles of seasons from this window and various others, and she knew the way the first frost sat on the south lawn in the mornings, and the way the light came differently through the east wing window in February, and the way the house smelled in summer when the roses came in through the open sashes. She knew this house the way you know a place that has held you, not always gently, but consistently, which was its own kind of thing. "Lord Cavendish," she said, "I am grateful. I want you to understand that I mean that completely." "I hear a qualification approaching," he said, not unkindly. "I want my name back," she said. "I want what is mine legally, properly, on record. I want that very much, and I intend to have it." She looked up at him. "But I do not want it handed to me by someone else's arrangements. Not again." She said it quietly, without heat. "I spent 5 years living inside a decision that was made for me by people who believed they were acting in my interest. I do not say this to diminish what you are offering, or what the Duke did, or the reasons behind any of it. I understand those reasons better now than I did yesterday. But I will not solve one instance of that pattern by stepping immediately into another." Lord Cavendish looked at her for a long moment. "You want to reclaim it yourself," he said. "I want to be the person who chooses," she said. "Whatever I choose, I want it to be mine." Another pause, and then Lord Cavendish did something she had not expected. He smiled, not a polite smile, not the social expression of a man managing a situation, but something genuine and a little rueful, the smile of a person who has just been reminded of someone. "Your mother," he said something very similar to her own father, the morning she told him she intended to marry Charles Ashby. Emma felt something move in her chest, a small, quiet thing. "Did he listen to her?" she asked. "No," Cavendish said, "he did not. It was the beginning of the estrangement." He set down his teacup. "I intend to do considerably better." He did not withdraw the offer. He simply said that it would remain open, in whatever form she chose to take it, on her terms and her timeline. He left her the name of his London solicitor, a man he described as honest, thorough, and capable of great discretion. He stood and shook her hand, the way you shake the hand of a person you are taking seriously, and he left. Emma sat in the cold parlor for a while after he had gone. She was aware of a feeling she did not quite have a word for, something expansive and slightly frightening, the feeling of a door standing open onto a view you have only imagined until now. It was not simple happiness. It was larger than that and less comfortable, the way real things tend to be. She was also aware, with a precision she found deeply inconvenient, that she was sitting in a house she did not want to leave. Not yet, not like this. She did not see the Duke until dinner. He was already at the table when she came in, the small dining room, the one used when there were no guests, which meant they sat at a table, designed for 12 with 6 empty chairs between them, and the particular awkwardness of 2 people who have said significant things to each other, and have not yet resolved them. He stood when she entered. He always stood. She had never decided how she felt about that, the courtesy that was impeccable and somehow, simultaneously, infuriating. They ate for some time in silence. It was not the old silence. The old silence had been smooth, the silence of 2 people who have established a functional distance and are maintaining it without much effort. This silence had texture. It had the uneven quality of ground that looks flat until you are walking on it. "Cavendish made you an offer," the Duke said finally, "not a question." "Yes." A pause. "Will you take it?" Emma looked at him across the table. He was looking at his plate, which was unusual. He was a man who looked at things directly, as a general rule. The plate-looking was, she thought, doing a great deal of work. "I told him I wanted to reclaim my name myself," she said, "on my own terms." The Duke looked up. "He accepted that," she said. Something happened in the Duke's expression, something swift and not entirely controlled, which was itself unusual enough to be notable. She watched it move across his face and tried to read it, the way she had tried to read him for 5 years from behind various degrees of distance, and she found she could not quite. Too many things at once. Too close. "That sounds," he said carefully, "like something you would do." "Does it?" "Yes," he looked at her steadily. "It sounds exactly like something you would do." There was something in his voice when he said it, not admiration exactly, or not only admiration. Something quieter than that. Something that had been there, she thought now, for a long time. Long enough that she should perhaps have noticed it before. Long enough that the not noticing said something about her that she was not sure she was ready to examine. "The question of why you didn't tell me," Emma said. "After Pell died, you said it was a more complicated question." "I did. I am still waiting for the answer." The Duke set down his fork. He looked at her across the table, across the empty chairs, across the distance that had always been between them, and that was, she was beginning to understand, not entirely structural. "I know," he said. And he said nothing more. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her glass and she looked away, and she let him keep it for now. Not because she was no longer interested in the answer, but because some part of her, the part that had been listening to him for 5 years from corridors and doorways, had begun to suspect what it was. And she was not yet ready. That night she stood at her window and looked at the south garden. At 11 o'clock, a figure appeared on the path below. The Duke walked the garden in the dark, the way he always did when something was troubling him. Emma watched him from the window. She had watched him do this a dozen times over the years, had always looked away after a moment, had always understood without articulating it that this was his private thing and not hers to observe. Tonight she did not look away. She stood at the window and watched him walk, and she thought about complicated answers, and she thought about 5 years, and she thought about a man who had paid debts that were not his, and written letters that were not signed, and kept a secret that had cost her something she could not fully calculate yet, but who had also kept her safe, in the cold functional way of a person who does not know how to say a thing and so does the thing instead, and hopes, perhaps, that it will be enough. It was not enough. But it was not nothing. She stood there until the garden was empty again, and the path was dark, and the only light left was the lamp she had left burning on the desk behind her. Tomorrow there would be more to say. There were decisions to make about London, about Cavendish's solicitor, about her name and what she intended to do with it. There were 5 years' worth of things that had not been said and would need to be, eventually, in one form or another. But tonight she stood at the window and she let herself feel the full complicated weight of where she was, in a house she had not chosen, that had become, without her permission, the place she thought of when she thought of home, and she did not try to resolve it into something simpler. Some things are not simple. That does not mean they are not true. Lady Constance took ill on a Thursday. It came on quickly, the way things sometimes do with the very old, not a dramatic collapse, nothing that announced itself with appropriate gravity but a quiet withdrawal, a dimming, like a lamp turned down by a careful hand. She did not come down to breakfast. By mid-morning she had not rung for her tea. The maid who went to check found her in bed, propped against her pillows, looking out the window with an expression of mild irritation that was, everyone agreed, a reassuring sign. The doctor came and went. He used words like asterisk rest and constitution, and not uncommon at her age in the careful, slightly evasive way of doctors who know more than they are saying, and have decided saying it will not help. He left a tincture and instructions, and the particular silence of a professional who has done what he can. Emma went upstairs at noon. She had not been asked. That was important to her, afterward, the fact of not having been asked, of having gone because she wanted to, because the thought of Lady Constance alone in that room with a maid who was kind but young and a house that was suddenly too quiet had made her set down what she was doing and go upstairs before she had consciously decided to. Lady Constance was awake. She looked smaller in the bed than she did in her customary chair by the window, the way people always look smaller horizontal, as if it is the uprightness that gives them their full dimensions. But her eyes were bright, and her expression, when Emma came in and sat down beside her, was the expression of a woman who has been waiting. "I wondered when you would come," she said. "I came as soon as I heard." A pause. Outside the window, the October garden was colorless and still. "Has my son spoken to you?" "Yes." "Has he told you everything?" Emma considered this. "I am not certain," she said, "what everything is." Lady Constance made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Honest girl," she said, "sit closer. My voice is not what it was today, and I find I have things to say." Emma moved her chair. For a while they were simply quiet together, the comfortable quiet of two people who have been sitting in the same rooms long enough that silence between them does not require management. Emma had missed this, she realized, in the days since the dining room, since the study, since everything that had shifted. She had been managing so many things, her own feelings, her understanding, the question of what came next, that she had not simply sat still in quite some time. "You are angry with him," Lady Constance said. "I was," Emma said. "I am less certain what I am now." "That is progress." The older woman's hands lay folded on the counterpane, fine hands, Emma had always thought, the hands of a person who had done real things with them. "He is not a man who explains himself. I say this not in his defense. It is simply true, and I believe in being accurate about one's children's failings before one is accurate about their virtues, because the virtues are usually more visible and the failings are where the trouble lives." Emma said nothing, she was listening. "He was 17 when his father died," Lady Constance said. "That is too young to inherit what Aldrich inherited. Not the titles are manageable, titles are simply paperwork and ceremony, but the rest of it. The weight of other people's expectations, the demands of the estate, the particular loneliness of a position that puts you at the center of a great many rooms while ensuring that almost no one in those rooms can speak to you honestly." She paused. "He learned very young that directness was a liability, that if you wanted something, genuinely wanted it in the way that makes you vulnerable, the safest course was to do rather than say, to act on the wanting without ever naming it, because named things can be refused. Done things are simply facts." Emma looked at the window. "He paid your father's debts," she said. "He did more than that." Lady Constance turned her head on the pillow to look at her. "In the winter of 1810, you had been here perhaps 8 months, a letter arrived, not addressed to Aldrich, addressed to you, though you were not known to have a forwarding address which should have made it impossible to find you. It was from a man acting on Pell's behalf. It was—" she stopped. "It was not a pleasant letter." Emma felt something move through her, cold and quiet. "He burned it," Lady Constance said. "He did not tell you it had come. He wrote a reply not as himself, as the estate solicitor, making it clear that the person they were looking for was not resident at Ashworth, and that further correspondence would be treated as harassment and referred to a magistrate." A pause. "There were 2 more letters over the following year. He dealt with them the same way. And then, in the spring of 1811, Pell became interested in a different matter, a larger one, and the letters stopped." "And then Pell died," Emma said. "In 1812, yes." Lady Constance's voice was careful now, the voice of a woman approaching something she has been deciding how to say. "After that, there was no practical reason for the secrecy to continue. Aldrich knew this. I told him so, in fact, quite directly, which I am sure will not surprise you." The ghost of a smile. "He agreed with me. He said he would speak to you, and then he did not." "Why?" The word came out before Emma could dress it up in anything more measured. The plain, direct question she had been carrying for days. Lady Constance was quiet for a moment. "The night you arrived," she said, "he came to find me after Mrs. Holt had shown you to your room. He stood in this room, that chair, where you are sitting, and he looked at the fire and he said—" She paused. Her voice, when she continued, was very quiet. She must never know I am watching over her." Emma went very still. "I asked him why," Lady Constance said. "He said that if you knew, it would change how you were in the house, that you would feel obligated or watched or managed, that you would spend your time at Ashworth performing gratitude instead of simply living." A pause. "He wanted you to be free in whatever way was possible inside those circumstances. He thought the not knowing was a gift." "It was not a gift," Emma said. Her voice was steady, just barely. "No," Lady Constance agreed. "It was not. It was the decision of a young man who understood generosity better than he understood people, who knew how to protect and did not yet know how to be known." She looked at Emma with the clear, unhurried look of someone who has been watching carefully for a long time. "He is older now." Emma looked down at her hands. She was aware of the anger again, but it was different now. It had changed shape over these days, the way things do when you understand them better. It was still real. The 5 years were still real. The gray dresses and the tea trays and the not knowing were still real, and she would not pretend otherwise to make the story neater. But underneath the anger, or alongside it, or threaded through it, in the way that complicated things are never one thing cleanly, was something else. She thought about a man standing in this room at 17, inheriting a weight he had not chosen, learning to act instead of speak. She thought about letters burned in winter fireplaces and replies written under a borrowed name. She thought about the South Garden at 11 o'clock, and a figure walking in the dark, and what it looked like when a person carries something without any expectation of being seen carrying it. She thought about 5 years of being in a house that had not known what to call her. She thought about the fact that someone in that house had known, and had chosen, imperfectly and wrongly and with the best available intentions, to let her simply be. "I am not forgiving him," she said. "I am not asking you to," Lady Constance said. "Not yet," Emma added, which was a different thing entirely, and she knew it, and from the expression on the face of the woman in the bed, Lady Constance knew it too. They sat together for the rest of the afternoon. Lady Constance dozed for a while. Emma read aloud to her from a novel she found on the bedside table, something fashionable and slightly ridiculous that Lady Constance had apparently been reading with great enjoyment, which Emma found unexpectedly charming. Twice, the older woman laughed at something softly, eyes still closed. The light changed outside the window. At one point, Lady Constance said, without opening her eyes, "He has your portrait, you know." Emma stopped reading. "I beg your pardon." "In his study. The small one, the one the painter did when you were perhaps 9 or 10, that your father commissioned. I do not know how he came by it." A pause. "It has been there since the first year." Emma sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to reading, and she did not let her voice change. She sat with Lady Constance until the evening. On her way back down the corridor, she passed the door of the study. She stopped. She stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the closed door, and she thought about what Lady Constance had told her, all of it. The letters and the replies and the particular sentence spoken in the dark by a young man who had not known, yet the cost of protecting people from the truth. She must never know I am watching over her. She thought about 5 years. She thought about what they had cost her and what they had made her, and how much of the person she was now had been shaped, quietly and without her knowledge, by the fact of being in this house, in this particular house, where someone had made a decision she had not consented to and had kept watching over her from behind a closed door for 5 years. She was still angry. She thought she would be angry about it for quite some time, in the deep private way of a person who has been done a wrong by someone who meant well, which is in some ways harder to resolve than a wrong done with indifference. But she was also, and this was the part she had not quite let herself admit until she was standing in the corridor alone with no one to be composed for, she was also not ready to leave. She had told Lord Cavendish she wanted to reclaim her name herself. She meant that. She intended to pursue it on her terms, through Cavendish's solicitor or another, until the thing was formalized and real and no longer dependent on anyone else's actions or protections. But she was going to do it from here. She did not entirely understand why. Not yet. She suspected the understanding was available to her if she was willing to look at it directly, but she was not quite ready for that either. Some things you approach from the side. She turned and walked back toward the east wing stairs. Behind her, the study door stayed closed. Inside it, if you had been there, you would have found a desk with its careful papers, a cup long cold, books with broken spines, a coat over the back of the second chair. And on the wall beside the window, in a modest frame that was slightly too plain for the quality of the thing inside it, a small portrait of a girl who looked about 9 years old, painted on a day that must have been summer, because the light in the painting was warm and she was wearing a white dress, and she was not quite smiling but almost her chin lifted, her eyes bright, looking at something just past the edge of the canvas with an expression that said, very clearly, that she had not yet learned to disappear. She found it by accident. That was, she thought afterward, the only honest way to describe it. She had not been looking. She had not set out that morning with any intention other than the practical one. Lady Constance had asked for the particular novel she had been reading before the illness, the one with the slightly ridiculous plot that she enjoyed with the unapologetic enthusiasm of a woman who has earned the right to read whatever she pleases. Emma had gone to fetch it from the downstairs library, the large one off the main corridor, and had found it without difficulty on the second shelf. She was on her way back upstairs when she took the wrong turn. It was not a turn she had ever taken before. 5 years at Ashworth Manor, and she had never been to the north end of the ground floor, not the corridor itself, not the rooms along it. She knew they existed the way you know about parts of a house that are never quite explained to you. They are there, they are closed, and you understand without being told that they are not yours. She stood at the entrance to the corridor for a moment. The house was quiet. Lady Constance's novel was in her hand. She had no particular reason to be here. She walked down the corridor. There were 4 doors. The first 3 were closed, unremarkable, the doors of rooms that were simply rooms. The 4th was ajar. She should have kept walking. She was aware of this even as she stopped, even as her hand came to rest, very lightly, against the door's edge. She pushed it open. It was a library. Not the large formal one, nothing like that. This was a working room, small and dense and entirely lived in. The kind of room that accumulates over years rather than being arranged. Books on every surface. A desk in the center that had clearly been used this morning. Papers weighted with a stone, ink not quite dry on something set to one side. 2 chairs, both of them worn to the particular comfort of chairs that have been sat in for a long time by the same person in the same way. The fire had been laid but not lit. The light came from the single window, gray and November thin, and it fell across the desk and across the things on the desk and across, Emma noticed, a particular shelf on the far wall that was different from the others. The other shelves held books. This one held objects. Small things, deliberately kept, the kind of shelf a person makes without quite meaning to, adding one thing and then another over the years until it becomes, by accumulation, a record of something. A pocket watch. A folded piece of paper, yellow with age. A ribbon white, fraying at the ends, the kind a child might have worn in her hair. A small brass button from what looked like a military coat. A dried flower, brown and papery and still recognizable as something that had once been a white rose. And at the far end of the shelf, a miniature oval delicate, the kind carried in a breast pocket or placed on a bedside table. Emma crossed the room. The miniature was of a woman she did not know. Young, perhaps 25, dark-haired, with an expression that was, she looked closer, that was familiar in some way she could not immediately place. Around the eyes, perhaps, something in the set of the mouth. Beside the miniature, propped against the edge of the shelf, was a journal. It was not new. The spine was creased with use, the cover worn soft at the corners. There was no title on it, no name. She should not have touched it. She knew this as her hand moved toward it, and she knew it as she picked it up. And she knew it in the moment, the very precise, irreversible moment, when it fell open in her hands because it was used to being open to a particular page, the way a book always falls open to the place it has been opened most. The page was near the middle. The handwriting was the Duke's. She recognized it from years of intercepted correspondence left on hall tables, from notes passed through Mrs. Holt, from the single letter he had written her in the first year about some matter of estate business she could no longer remember. She read one line. Only one. She did not intend to read more, and afterward she was almost certain she had not, and yet the one line was enough to change the entire shape of the room around her. She asked me today why she is here. I gave her the answer I have prepared. It was true, and it was not enough, and I watched her accept it, and I think she deserves a great deal better than what I am able to give her. Emma stood very still. The fire was unlit. The room was cold. Outside the window the November garden was stripped bare, and the light was the particular light of mornings that do not intend to warm. She turned back one page. She has begun taking her meals in the east dining room instead of upstairs. I have not commented on this. I find that I am glad of it in a way I have not examined. She turned back further, to somewhere early in the journal, a page whose corner was turned down. She is angry today. She did not show it at dinner, but I could see it in the way she held herself, the way she holds herself when she is managing something. I have noticed she manages a great deal. I wonder sometimes if she knows how much of herself she is spending on that. Emma closed the journal. She stood with it in her hands and she looked at the shelf, the ribbon, the button, the dried rose, and she thought about 5 years, and she thought about what Lady Constance had said, and she thought about the portrait in the study, and she thought about the sentence that had just rearranged itself in her chest and would not, she suspected, be moved for a very long time. She must never know I am watching over her. She had been angry at that sentence. She was still, in some part of herself, angry at it, at the presumption of it, at the paternalism, at the 5 years of not knowing that it had produced. But she understood it now, in a way she had not before. It was not the sentence of a man who did not care what she knew. It was the sentence of a man who was afraid of what would happen if she did. She put the journal back on the shelf, carefully at its angle against the miniature. She turned around. The Duke was standing in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. Long enough, she thought, from his expression, which was not the closed window expression, was not the controlled blankness, was not anything she had a name for from the 5 years of watching him. It was something she had no category for yet. Something that looked, from a certain angle, like a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been seen carrying it, and does not know yet whether to put it down. Neither of them spoke. The journal was on the shelf. Between them the desk, the worn chairs, the unlit fire, the gray November light doing nothing to make any of this simpler. Emma looked at him. He looked back at her. She thought about all the things that could be said in a moment like this, all the careful, managed, well-constructed sentences she had spent 5 years becoming very good at producing. She had a great many of them available. She could deploy any one of them now, and they would both understand, without discussion, that she had chosen distance, and the distance would close back over this moment like water over a stone, and they would go on being what they had been. She did not reach for any of them. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she said. Her voice came out quiet, not angry, not managed, just the question in its plainest form with nothing around it. The Duke looked at her. He was quiet for long enough that she thought, for one cold moment, that he was going to retreat again, was going to produce one of his own careful sentences, was going to take the door that was standing open and close it, gently but finally, the way he had always been so skilled at closing things. He did not. Because, he said, and then he stopped, and she could see it, the thing he was doing that was different from every other conversation they had ever had. He was not choosing a prepared answer. He was finding the actual one. Because I have never said it, any of it, and I did not know, he stopped again. He looked at her with his face entirely open, stripped of the architecture she had always assumed was simply how he was. And she saw what was underneath it, what had apparently been underneath it for some time, and it was so plainly and specifically what she had begun in the past week, to half suspect and refuse to look at directly that she felt the breath go out of her in a way that was not quite pain and not quite relief, and was entirely, unmistakably, the feeling of a true thing. You were afraid I would leave, she said. It was not quite right. She knew it wasn't quite right even as she said it, but it was the closest she could get from the outside. He looked at her for a long moment. I was afraid, he said carefully, that if you knew who you were, you would understand that you had never needed to be here, that you would understand you had a name and a claim and a future that had nothing to do with Ashworth Manor or any decision I had made on your behalf, and that once you understood that, he stopped. I was afraid you would go. The room was very quiet. And that mattered to you, Emma said, not a challenge, something more careful than that. Yes, he said, simply, without decoration, the way he said the things he was certain of. It mattered to me. Emma looked at him. She thought about 5 years. She thought about the cost of them, which was real, and the shape of them, which had made her into something she did not think she could have become anywhere else, which was also real and considerably more difficult to be tidy about. She thought about the journal, and the portrait, and the letters burned in winter, and a man who had stood in his mother's room and said she must never know, as if the not knowing were a kindness and not, as it had turned out, the most expensive gift he had ever given either of them. She thought about the fact that she was standing in his library with Lady Constance's novel in her hand, and 5 years behind her, and the whole of her own future, finally and properly hers, in front of her. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough that there was no longer any of the careful distance that had always existed between them. No corridor, no dining table, no desk to put between themselves and whatever this was. She looked up at him. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said. I am still angry about the 5 years. I know. That will take time. Yes, he said, I know that too. She looked at him for a moment longer. I am not leaving, she said. Something happened in his face, quiet and deep, and entirely unguarded. The thing she had watched him keep contained for 5 years from behind various distances, finally allowed to simply be there. Emma, he said, just her name. The first time in 5 years he had called her by her first name. She felt it land in her chest like a key turning in a lock that has been closed for a very long time. Aldrich, she said. And the door, which had been standing open for quite some time, finally admitted them both. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks in advance. This was, Emma had learned, the appropriate interval for a ball of this particular significance, long enough to ensure that no one of consequence could claim a prior engagement, short enough to maintain the impression that the hostess had not been planning it since approximately the previous spring. Lady Harcastle, who was hosting, had the kind of social precision that other women studied and despaired of ever replicating, and the guest list for her annual winter ball was treated in certain circles with the reverence ordinarily reserved for Acts of Parliament. Emma's invitation had been addressed, in Lady Harcastle's own hand, to Lady Emma Vane Ashby *. She had stood in the entrance hall of Ashworth Manor for a long moment when Mrs. Holt brought it to her, the envelope in her hands, her name on it in dark ink, written by someone who knew exactly who she was and had written it without hesitation or explanation, as if it had always been this way. It had taken 4 months. Cavendish's solicitor had been, as promised, thorough and discreet. The documentation had been assembled with a patience that Emma suspected had been expensive and did not inquire about. There had been 2 meetings with a king's council whose chambers smelled of old paper, and whose manner suggested he had seen everything the law had to offer and found most of it mildly disappointing. There had been a formal registration, a county record, a notice in the Gazette of the matter-of-fact and deliberately undramatic kind that said, in essence, that a thing which had always been true was now also official. Aldrich had accompanied her to every meeting. He had not announced this intention. He had simply appeared at the carriage on the morning of the first appointment, correctly dressed, with the expression of a man who has decided something and considers the decision closed. Emma had looked at him. He had looked back at her. She had got into the carriage. By the 3rd meeting, the solicitor had stopped introducing him as the Duke of Ashworth, and had begun introducing him as Lady Emma's. And then pausing, in the tactful way of a man who is paid to read situations, before settling on associate. Emma had found this privately very funny, in the deep and slightly giddy way that things are funny when your life has recently changed shape, and you are still learning the new dimensions of it. Aldrich had not found it funny. He had found it frustrating in the particular way of a man who knows exactly what he would like to be introduced as and has not yet, quite, managed to say so in the correct setting. He had managed it in October. Not in a solicitor's chambers, not in a formal setting of any kind, which Emma had come to understand, was simply not where this particular man operated honestly. He had managed it on a Tuesday afternoon in the walled kitchen garden, of all places, where Emma had been attempting to have a conversation with the head gardener about the herb beds, and Aldrich had appeared, again without announcement, which she had also come to understand was simply how he moved through his own estate, and had stood at the garden gate looking at her for a moment with the expression she now knew meant he had decided something. The head gardener had found a compelling reason to be elsewhere almost immediately. Aldrich had said, with the directness of a man who has been practicing saying a thing for quite some time, and has finally simply decided to say it, that he was aware the last year had been complicated, and that he understood if she needed more time, and that he had no interest in making any decision for her about anything for the rest of their natural lives, but that he would like, if she was willing, to know whether the life she was building, the one that was hers now, properly and legally and completely hers, had any room in it for him. He had said it standing at a garden gate, with his hands in his coat pockets and November coming in cold off the hills, and it was possibly the least romantic setting Emma could have imagined for a conversation of this kind, and she had looked at him for a long moment and thought, yes, this is exactly right. This is exactly who he is. This is the man who burns letters in winter fireplaces and stands in the dark garden at 11 o'clock and keeps a journal for 5 years and cannot say a word of it in a drawing room but will say all of it eventually at a garden gate in November. She had said yes. She had said it without ceremony, which was also exactly right, and he had looked at her in the way she was still not entirely accustomed to, as if she were the answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time, and then he had kissed her hand and offered her his arm and walked back toward the house with her, and that had been that. Lady Constance, upon being told, had said, finally asterisk, in a tone that suggested she had been waiting for this particular piece of news for approximately 4.5 years, and had begun to find the delay personally offensive. The Harcastle ball was on the 15th of December. London in December had a quality Emma had forgotten, or rather, had never properly known from the inside, having only ever glimpsed it from the outside, from carriages and doorways, and the particular vantage point of someone watching other people's lives through glass. The city in winter was dense and bright and cold, the streets of Mayfair lit from the windows of houses doing their season's work, the air carrying the mingled smells of coal smoke and pine, and the particular festive desperation of the English upper classes attempting warmth. They had come up from Ashworth 3 days before. Lady Constance had declined the journey on grounds of her knee and the weather, and what she described as a philosophical objection to London in December, and had settled herself into the winter drawing-room at Ashworth with her novels and her tea, and the cat that had appeared from somewhere in October, and that she now referred to as my companion with a dignity that discouraged inquiry. Lord and Lady Cavendish were already in town. Everett Cavendish had met them for dinner the previous evening. His wife Margaret, who was exactly as Emma's mother had apparently been, precise and warm and entirely willing to say what she meant, had spent most of the meal talking to Emma about things Emma actually wanted to talk about, which was a social experience so novel that Emma had come home slightly dazed by it. The ball was at 8. Emma dressed in her room at the Ashworth townhouse, a room she had chosen herself, which sounds like a small thing and was not, with the assistance of a lady's maid who was new and earnest, and had spent the first week in Emma's employ in a state of some uncertainty about who exactly she was working for, having received conflicting intelligence from various quarters. She had resolved this uncertainty, as far as Emma could tell, by simply watching Emma carefully and making her own assessment. Emma respected this. The dress was deep green, not the muted, apologetic green that blended into walls, but the green of something that intended to be noticed, that had opinions about being in a room. Emma had chosen it herself, from a modiste in Bond Street who had taken one look at her and begun pulling out fabrics with the focused energy of a woman presented with an interesting problem. She looked at herself in the glass for a long moment. The woman looking back at her was wearing her own name. That was the thought that came, simple and enormous, the way true things tend to be. She was wearing her own name and her own dress in her own room, preparing for a ball to which she had been invited by her own right. She had not known, a year ago, how much weight she had been carrying in not having those things. You do not know what you are compensating for until you stop compensating. She picked up her gloves and went downstairs. Aldrich was waiting in the entrance hall. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, and she watched his face do the thing she had 5 years of practice at reading, and was only now permitted to read directly. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since October, without the closed window expression, without the careful management, with all of that set aside in favor of simply looking at her the way he meant to. "You look," he began. "Don't say well, Emma said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I was not going to say well, What were you going to say?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "I was going to say," he said, "that I have spent a considerable amount of time this past year attempting to understand what it is I feel when I look at you, and I have concluded that the English language has not, on the whole, risen to the occasion." Emma looked at him. "That," she said, "is the most Aldrich Voss sentence you have ever said to me." "Yes," he agreed, "I thought it might be." She took his arm, and they went out into the December night. The Harcastle ballroom was everything London in December knew how to be. Candlelight on 200 faces, the particular music of a room full of people who have known each other for years, and are performing the ritual of society with the practiced ease of a very long rehearsal. Silk and wool and the distant smell of pine from the garlands along the gallery rail. Whispers, laughter, the architectural geometry of people arranging themselves around power and beauty, and the fascinating machinery of who is seen with whom. Emma stood at the threshold and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was not on the outside of it. She did not know everyone in the room. She was not known by everyone in the room. There would be introductions tonight that she was not looking forward to, and conversations that would require a degree of composure she had become quite good at producing, but that still cost something. And at least 3 people who had been present at Lord Harcastle's dining table a year ago, who would have to manage whatever it was they felt about the distance between what she had been carrying then and what she was carrying now. She was prepared for all of this. She was also, she found, as she entered the room on Aldrich's arm, not frightened by any of it. That was new. That was one of the things the year had given her, not confidence exactly, which implied something bright and forward-facing that was not quite her register, but something quieter and more durable. A settled knowledge of her own ground, an understanding that she had survived 5 years of not knowing who she was in a house that did not know what to call her, and that she had come out of it with herself more or less intact, which was not nothing. Lady Hardcastle found her within 10 minutes, which Emma had expected. She was a small woman with extraordinary posture and the eyes of someone who has been running social calculus in her head since approximately the age of 7. She looked at Emma with an expression that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and appraising, the expression of a woman deciding whether to approve of something she has already decided she approves of. "Lady Emma," she said, warmly, with the small emphasis on the title that was not quite emphasis, just a note, just a recognition, just a woman of Lady Hardcastle's particular intelligence, making it quietly clear that she understood what the name represented and had already chosen her side. "I am so very glad you came." Emma thanked her, she meant it. Lady Hardcastle moved on. Aldrich at her elbow. "She told Lord Fenwick last week that you were the most interesting woman to arrive in London society in a decade. She said that before meeting me. She tends to do her research in advance." Emma looked at him sideways. "Did she say it to you specifically?" "She said it to my mother." Emma thought about this. "Your mother is in Derbyshire." "My mother," Aldrich said, "maintains a correspondence that I find consistently awe-inspiring in its scope." Emma laughed. It came out fully, without management, which was also one of the things the year had given her, the ability to laugh in a room without calculating first whether it was the appropriate thing to do. She felt Aldrich's hand cover hers on his arm briefly, and then release it. She saw Lord Cavendish across the room. He was speaking to a tall young man Emma did not recognize, but he caught her eye and raised his glass, and she raised hers back. And it was one of those small, quiet, sufficient moments that do not require anything more than what they are. She saw Lord Fenwick, who had been at the dining table that morning, looking at her now from a distance with an expression that she decided, charitably, to read as reassessment rather than discomfort. She saw, near the musicians, a woman she recognized as having been introduced to her last year at a garden party as someone or other's niece, who had looked through Emma the way people look through the furniture, and was now looking at her with the particular expression of someone revising their earlier assessment, and not finding the process entirely comfortable. Emma did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel triumphant, and she did not. What she felt was something more settled than triumph. The feeling of a thing having come right, not dramatically, not with the violent satisfaction of reversal, but quietly, in the way that things come right when they are simply allowed to be what they were always going to be. Later, past midnight, the ball thinning to its devoted remainder, the candles lower, the music slower, she found herself standing at the edge of the room. Aldrich was across the ballroom. He had been caught by a man from the Lords whose name Emma had learned, and immediately found less interesting than almost anything else in the room. And he was enduring this conversation with the expression of a man who is being polite at some personal cost. She caught his eye from across the room. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since October, the same way he had looked at her in the study on the night everything changed, and in the garden in November, and in the entrance hall this evening, with the language having failed him and him saying so, which was more than enough. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she let her eyes move away, not to be coy, not to perform indifference, but because she was standing in this room with her own name and her own dress and her own future fully and properly hers, and she wanted, for just one moment, to feel the full size of it without any other feeling beside it. She had poured tea for earls. She had poured it for viscounts, for foreign diplomats, for men whose names appeared in debrets beside titles that stretched back centuries. She had stood at their elbows with a silver pot and a steady hand, and not one of them had looked at her face. She looked around the room now, at the men and women of the world she had watched from outside for 5 years, and she thought, I am here. I am actually here, and it is mine, and no one gave it to me. She heard footsteps. She did not need to turn to know who it was. She had 5 years of practice at knowing where he was in a room. He came to stand beside her. The man from the Lords had apparently been released. They stood together at the edge of the room and looked at the ball, the candlelight and the silk, and the long, elaborate machinery of the world they were both, for different reasons and in different ways, somewhat outside of. Are you ready to go home? He said. Home. The word sat in her chest with the particular warmth of a thing that has been earned rather than assumed. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was not going to say anything more flowery than that. She knew this about him now, had learned it with the careful attention of a person who has spent years developing fluency in a particular language. And she knew that home from him was not a logistical question, but everything he did not know how to say in a room full of people, and everything he would say later in the quiet, in the way he had learned, finally, to say things. Yes, she said. And the Duke of Ashworth offered his arm to Lady Emma Vane Ashby, and she took it, and they walked out of the ballroom together, and the room full of earls and viscounts and the elegant machinery of a world that had once not known her name, watched them go. She had once poured tea for the most powerful men in England. Now they stood when she entered the room, and the only man whose opinion had ever truly mattered had been walking toward her in one way or another for 5 years. He had simply needed her to stop disappearing long enough for him to arrive. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.